very good evening, everyone. Now, those of you unfortunate enough to know me will realise that I do things a little differently. And in terms of our current affairs program tonight, we could have plenty to say about Israel, and indeed we've picked something concerning Israel, but it's indirectly connected with Israel. So we'll just set a little bit of contextual overview, some of which we've read tonight. Jesus had foretold the utter destruction of the temple. We're told elsewhere that it was Peter, James, John and Andrew who, astonished at this, approached him and asked him in Luke 21 just one question, verse 7. Luke 21 verse 7, Master, when shall these things be, and what sign will there be when these things shall come to pass? Matthew, of course, gives a much more extended question, the sign of your coming and of the end of the age. And then Jesus goes on to provide an answer to all those three questions, but Luke 21 gives us the best timeline to consult. So Jesus foretold all those events, verses 8 to 19, that would lead up to the siege of Jerusalem. And there would be one unmistakable sign: Jerusalem surrounded with armies, as verse 20 says. There would be horrors attending that siege, and they were truly terrible. And Brother Robert Roberts, in his book, The Ways of Providence, addresses some of that. It doesn't make for pretty reading. Jerusalem would be captured and then trampled by the Gentiles until that trampling would be limited, but we quite frankly acknowledge that it's not completely over. So whilst Israel has responsibility for Jerusalem, there is the Dome of the Rock and the Mosque of Omar, and of course the Muslims control that and ban non-Muslims from entering in. So we accept that the trampling is not completely ended, but substantially Jerusalem is in Israeli hands, and it is from this time that certain consequences flow. The focus of our attention is in verse 25. There will be sign the sun, moon, the stars, and upon the earth distress of nations with perplexity. This word perplexity. The Standard English Desk Dictionary defines perplexity as bewilderment or a cause of this entangled state. And of course, it doesn't help that this word occurs only in Luke 21 and verse 25. Vine, in his expository dictionary, suggests that literally it means at a loss for a way, finding no solution. And he draws attention to papyri, which uses this particular word and has the sense of at one's wit's end, at a loss how to proceed. There is a related verb, and Bullinger comments that it has the sense of not knowing what to do. So there's a distress of nations. And I want to solve that distress, but they don't know how to. They're at a complete loss as to how they're going to go about that distress of nations. Now, we've chosen a few examples tonight out of current affairs to illustrate that. And our first example is Britain and Brexit. Now, on the 1st of January 1973, Britain entered what was then the European Common Market under the leadership of Edward Heath's Conservative government. That membership was always fraught. Just over 2 years later, they had a national referendum, and the majority then voted to remain within the European Union. Now, what made the Union so attractive? Well, it was a common market then, not the EU. That came later. What was appealing was that, according to the UK Daily Telegraph, European countries devastated by war had been given lasting peace and prosperity. One of the reasons Britain used to be keen on Europe was precisely that. In the 1960s and the 1970s, the continent looked like it was doing a lot better than us, the UK. More modern, more prosperous, more socially harmonious. By contrast, throughout the power cuts and strikes of those decades, the UK was haunted by fears of terminal national decline. So there was a driver for Britain entering the common market in the first place, and it seemed like a great idea. The referendum of 1975 had, there were two banners produced. Pretty obvious what they're about. But the Leave people, their argument was that Britain would be unshackled from Europe and would be able to go into the world. That's a more modern picture, but it emphasises the strength of feeling over this latest example of Brexit. So, 2016, wrong century, there was a vote. The British held another vote, and this time the vote was in the majority to leave Europe. Several months of negotiations followed, and on the 16th of January, Theresa May put a Brexit deal to Parliament, which was defeated 432 to 202, a very solid defeat. What was distressing was that 118 Conservative MPs, ironically, from both the Leave and Remain wings, voted with Labor against the deal. Immediately, Labor leader Jeremy Corbyn tabled a no-confidence vote, and the significance of that is, had it been successful at the time, would have triggered a general election at a time when Britain was still trying to finalise the terms of its exit from the EU. In the event, Theresa May survived the no-confidence vote. Well, that's all right. What's the way forward? Some want a further referendum on Brexit. Some want a softer version of Brexit than what Prime Minister May proposed. Some want to leave the EU with no deal, a hard Brexit, or crash out of the EU. Some want to stop it altogether. Some argue that the scale of the defeat actually helps Prime Minister May negotiate a better deal from the EU. Well, that was whistling in the dark. The EU was adamant that there would be no significant change to the deal. Here it is, a picture of deadlock. What's the way forward? The simple answer is that nobody knows. Perplexity, at a loss to how to proceed. Now, the ABC had a very interesting comment on this, which I thought was worth reproducing. The time for any plausible, and this was written on the 16th of January, the time for any plausible compromise is fast approaching the end. Britain is far more likely now than it was 24 hours ago either to be left without a deal or being forced to have to abandon Brexit altogether through a second referendum. Now, of course, when we prepared this, there was a second vote on May's Brexit proposal. That too was defeated. So the next vote called was, well, do you want to crash out of the EU altogether? And Parliament said, no, we don't want to do that. So the third vote was that the Brexit will be delayed for about 3 months. But the point But those votes haven't changed anything. That's the point I really want to get across. Nothing has actually changed. May is not going to get a different deal from the EU. So, the point that the article makes, whatever they may say now, nobody saw this coming at the beginning of the Brexit negotiations. Throughout the referendum campaign in 2016, all sides presumed that if Britain did vote to leave, the country would end up in some kind of long-term relationship with the European Union. Those hopes are looking exceedingly forlorn. Prime Minister May, at the first vote which saw her plan defeated, yeah, I'd be unhappy too. But that's the strength of feeling that this has aroused. There are people in Britain who actually think that May has been treasonous in her negotiations. The Queen has to be exceptionally circumspect. She is not allowed to make direct political statements. That's part of the terms of the constitutional monarchy of Great Britain. Yet even the Queen felt it was necessary to say this: the continued emphasis on patience, friendship, a strong community focus and considering the needs of others are as important today as they were when the group, I don't know what group that was founded all those years ago. As we look for new answers in the modern age, I, for one, prefer the tried and tested recipes like speaking well of each other and respecting different points of view, coming together to seek out the common ground and never losing sight of the bigger picture. To me, these approaches are timeless and I commend them to everyone. Even with the most deeply held differences, treating the other person with respect and as a fellow human being is always a good first step towards greater understanding. And you might think back to the previous slide where people marched through London accusing May of high treason. Now, as if that was not enough, would anybody like to hazard a guess who that lady is? Still in the United Kingdom. She was a member of the Labor Party. No? Luciana Claire Goldsmith, née Berger. Yeah, who cares? She's a Jewish member of Parliament. As I said, she was a member of the Labor Party and she quit the Labor Party citing bullying and institutional anti-Semitism. She, along with 6 other Labor MPs, decided to form an independent grouping. The other 6 who left were vehement critics of Jeremy Corbyn's politics and were leading supporters of a second referendum on Brexit that the Labor leader had resisted. Now, that information comes from The Guardian. Now, Luciana Claire Goldsmith, née Berger, is not one to make accusations lightly. When she quit, these were the sort of unedifying Twitter posts and other social media posts. You always count on Jew to show their true colours eventually. And you'll notice at the bottom, Hitler was right. Appalling. Right? And there's a snapshot picture of Luciana Berger, the Star of David on her forehead. Labor never failed on immigration. It's just, just appalling. That was a comment from a Labor sympathiser. Now, what was even more interesting was this. the 6 Labor MPs who resigned had no indication whatever that Luciana Berger was going to quit the Labor Party, albeit for different reasons. Likewise, they had no idea that 3 Tory MPs were also going to resign. This comment from The Guardian again is worthwhile. Such was the relative lack of organisation that they had no idea they were going to be joined soon after by an 8th Labor MP, Joan Ryan, spurred into action by Berger's testimony. So when Joan Ryan heard what Berger had to say, she said, that's it, and she resigned from the Labor Party as well. Likewise, the 3 Tory MPs who later joined the group had no prior warning about the timing of the Labor resignations. And so those 3 ladies announced their resignations, and the new group were taking selfies as they sat together in the Commons chamber for Prime Minister's questions. So once again, why should we care? Well, Britain's scheduled to leave the EU on what, 12 days' time? Regardless of whether there's a deal with the EU or not. Well, now we know that there is no deal with the EU and they won't be leaving on the 29th of March. So it just enhances the uncertainty of it all. A divided Labor Party is seen as manna from heaven for the beleaguered Theresa May. The sensible centre wants to replicate the amazing success of French President Emmanuel Macron, who 12 months before the presidential election didn't even have a party. And he was the model of the so-called sensible centre. Political pundits, however, lament that that is by no means a certainty. So what's the only certainty? Uncertainty. And at such a time. I want to proceed briefly now to introduce the second aspect of distress of nations with perplexity. The good old US government shutdown. You know, we might despair of politics in Australia, but at least our Commonwealth public sector workers continue to work and continue to get paid. Not so in the United States. President Trump and Congress were unable to agree on an appropriations bill or to a resolution to extend the deadline for passing such a bill, with the result that in early December, 9 federal departments employing 800,000 workers had to shut down partially or in full. That represented 25% of US government activities. The cause of it all was that Donald Trump wanted $5.6 billion to build the wall, stop people coming in from Mexico into the United States. The Democratic-controlled Congress, the lower house, refuses to include that funding. Now, it doesn't hurt that Mr. Trump has shifted his position. He repeatedly promised to build the wall and that Mexico would pay for it. Well, you can imagine Mexico's response for that. Then he requested $18 billion for a fence replacement, presumably along the entire length of the US-Mexican border. Then he said he would consider yet another proposal. There was, in fact, agreement on funding measures by President Trump and the Congress. Unfortunately, Mr. Trump took some notice of criticism from various quarters, principally his own conservative voter base, and as a result, he vetoed and withdrew support for funding measures. National monuments, part of the US Parks and Wildlife. All national parks are closed. There's a patrolman. I don't think he's getting paid. Now, I included this one because, as usual, some of these things have some unexpected consequences. Given the length and breadth of the United States, not too dissimilar to Australia, there is a need for federal employees to shunt about all over the country. And Delta Airlines has the contract for moving government employees. Well, of course, there's 800,000 people don't even have jobs, so they're not flying anywhere. And there's been a significant dent in Delta Airlines' income. An airport. Yeah, so what? Well, one of the government's departments affected by the shutdown is the Federal Aviation Authority, who employ air traffic controllers. Now, you can't not have air traffic controllers monitoring. That's a recipe for disaster. So air traffic controllers were directed to turn up for work and not get paid. Well, that's going to work real well, isn't it? And what has happened is that a rising number of air traffic controllers have either called in sick or resigned altogether. Anyone travelling in the US soon? There's a National Treasury Employees Union member end the shutdown. Some of the 800,000 federal employees who've been going unpaid since the 22nd of December are in increasingly dire straits as the shutdown enters its fifth week. Well, that was the 21st of January. Now, to this stage, permanent funding measures have not been approved. With the result that many of them have set up appeals on crowdfunding sites GoFundMe, seeking financial aid to pay rent or to feed and clothe their children. Looks like the Unemployment Benefits Department has also shut down. The Democrats insist they will not negotiate until government is reopened. Gridlock, stalemate. Well, wonderful way to run a country. And so opinion polls suggest that most Americans blame Mr. Trump more than the Democrats for the shutdown. So where to from here? There's no solution. Congress and the President have been unable to field a middle ground. And in fact, on recent news, you might recall recently that President Trump issued a state of emergency, which would allow him through presidential decree to divert funds from other programs to build the wall. The Congress voted that down. Even the Senate, which is majority Republican, voted that down. And Trump, in typical fashion, vetoed the bill. There have been some other fallouts, and all of them have some consequences. Now, when we use the internet, we might not realise, but a lot of the sites, to prevent hacking and to assure us that they are genuine sites, have what are known as security certificates. Security certificates for dozens of official United States websites have not been renewed. Affected websites include the US Departments of Justice, the Courts of Appeal, and NASA. Hey, it's pretty good, isn't it? You know, you're going to launch a mission into space, and it's all internet driven, and the security certificates for that website, and so you don't know if you're actioning the correct website. Great. In addition to pay, Coast Guard employees are missing federal housing subsidies that help them offset their expensive coastal housing. All right? You know, I was actually this is ex-Sydney sider speaking right here. I used to think, Port Hughes, so many hundreds of thousands of dollars. What are you doing paying that amount of money for Port Hughes? Well, it's a water view, isn't it? Righto. So you can't have the Coast Guard living 200 kilometres inland. They've got to live on the waterfront. And it's expensive. So they've got to have subsidies for their housing. Well, sorry, they don't have any. They don't have any. Anyone got any food imported from the United States? Well, you might need to be aware of this. The Food and Drug Administration has suspended all non-essential work, causing nationwide concerns over unsafe food. Most inspections of food handling have stopped. That all sounds fairly highfalutin and, we're not touched by that. Well, yeah, there are personal outcomes. A couple wanted to get married in a national park. Well, their wedding reservation at a park was abruptly cancelled due to administration. And that information came from the BBC website. Okay, it's a distressing picture. Let's pause now for our next hymn 376. Thank you, Andrew. Anyone know who that gentleman is? Try the ABC. Thank you very much, Alan Kohler. Why have I got a picture of Alan Kohler? Well, he presents the finance news. But there's a thing called the volatility index, measures the volatility on share markets. I'm not going to read all of that. I'm just going to pick out some clauses there. The volatility index, primarily used as an indicator of investor sentiment and market expectations. If that index is high, they expect there'll be a very large change in the various stock exchange indices over the next 30 days. Now, when the volatility index is at a relatively high level and market expectations for high level of volatility, here it is, investor sentiment is perceived to be uncertain. Well, why do we care about investor sentiment? Well, if investors are uncertain, they won't invest. No investment means no jobs, no housing, no factories, no whatever, no growth in the economy. And that translates into fewer jobs. And that translates into reduced income. Yeah, investors do want to be sure that they'll get a return on their investment. Or if they've lent money on an investment, that money will be repaid. So, uncertainty in investment is a real problem. Now, the Philippines, a near neighbour of ours. You know, we're looking to get... This is a classic, and what makes this a classic was that I was searching for something else and I tripped over this one. And it's a classic for describing the problems of investor uncertainty. Now, President Duterte, who's an interesting sort of character at the best of times, has proposed a tax reform for attracting better and high quality opportunities, nothing like long-sounding government bills, so of course it gets an acronym, TRAHABO. That has triggered deferment of expansion projects, not just in the manufacturing sector, but also in power, particularly renewable energy. Energy Development Corporation, a majority-owned firm by the Lopez Group, indicated that it had put at least 9 projects on hold, partly because of the uncertainty and the investment risks posed by the second tax reform package of the Duterte administration. He expounded that the second tax reform package is widely viewed as a major uncertainty to investments and the entire industry, because people are looking at their numbers and they don't know whether they're going to have 10% income tax or 30% income tax. They don't know if they're going to import without duties or with duties. Great plan, but it's led to uncertainty within the Philippines. Anybody know where this is? Or what system it's part of? Oh, well done. It is part of the Murray-Darling, as is cotton irrigation on the Balonne River, and there is a tributary of the Darling, the Barwon, at Colla Renabri, looking a little bit the worse for wear. And so even in Australia, we have significant problems with a major water resource. The Murray-Darling system drains something like 1/7 of the Australian landmass, and there's an outline of the basin. And of course, you know, we either pay a levy to the Mount Lofty Management Board or we pay a levy to the Murray-Darling Basin Authority for management of that water resource. Now, what makes the Murray-Darling system particularly challenging is that not only does it drain 1/7 of Australia's landmass, it receives little direct rainfall. It's very, very dependent on runoff from the Great Divide and the waters flowing westward into the Great Divide. The basin covers 5 states and territory governments who, according to the Constitution, are responsible for managing water resources. How do you think that's going? Really well? No, not at all. The average flow through the system is estimated at 13,000 gigalitres, of which 11,500 gigalitres are removed for irrigation, industrial use and domestic supply. And agriculture is estimated takes 95% of that, including growing such water-hungry crops as rice and cotton. Oh, that was all right. For a while, we got away with that. It's all good. But then, in early 2000, came what farmers described as the big dry. And farmers experienced water shortages unlike ever they had experienced before. The drought was so severe that even the Darling River stopped flowing. The Murray-Darling Basin Authority, in response to the big dry, released a draft plan to secure long-term ecological health of that system. Now, as is to be expected, there were protests and concerns. Some went as far as to say that the plan would obliterate Murrumbidgee Valley communities. Unsurprisingly, the plan was supported by various groups, including the Australian Conservation Foundation and Environment Victoria. So where do we go from here? How do we sort that one out? Just to add to the woes of the entire system, South Australian government, based on allegations of water theft from the system, set up a royal commission. And the commissioner's findings were particularly interesting. And I use the term interesting in the view of the curse of Confucius. It found that Commonwealth officials had committed gross maladministration, negligence and unlawful actions in drawing up the multi-billion-dollar deal to save Australia's largest river system. So, some people are looking for more water savings to be returned to the environment. Well, as to be expected, New South Wales ministers are adamant they would resist further cuts to the water entitlements of farmers as recommended by the report. The Commission was, of course, hampered by the fact that the federal government refused permission to allow its bureaucrats to give evidence. That's a report from The Guardian, the Australian Guardian, accessed on the 9th of February. Now, the Murray-Darling Basin Authority opined that the Royal Commission's call effectively proposed abandoning the basin plan and starting over again. Once again, a clash of where to go, what to do. The MDBA considers this would be a reckless act. It would set back progress towards a healthy and sustainable basin and cause substantial uncertainty for basin communities. While many people support the concept of a basin plan, there is often sharp disagreement up and down the rivers and across different stakeholder groups about the most appropriate settings. We could say that the MDBA was exceedingly restrained in its language. So that's a distressing outcome. 3 items of current affairs emphasising the perplexity and the ongoing uncertainty of managing men's affairs. Okay, well, that's all very fine. How will Jesus Christ make a difference? And we might not like this, but there is a premise to start from. Let's have a look, please, at Isaiah 57, verses 20 to 21. Isaiah 57, verses 20 to 21. Now, you know, in talking about fear and uncertainty and perplexity, we haven't chosen trivial issues like, I might be certain that my pension will get paid tomorrow. But, you know, if the government runs out of money, well, that's probably not a good outcome for me. But we're talking about significant issues. The way forward for a nation, 800,000 US public sector workers not getting paid, still not getting paid, and a massive river system in severe trouble. You know, we're talking about significant challenges. What's the starting point? Verse 20 of Isaiah 57. The wicked are like the troubled sea when it cannot rest, whose waters cast up mire and dirt. There is no peace, says my God, to the wicked. And we have to recognise that with the general, despite Trump's protestation of God bless, etc., the fact of the matter is that neither the UK, the US, nor Australia are particularly honouring of Almighty God. And so it's hardly surprising that they are caught up as the troubled sea. That's the first premise that we start from. God alone, through Jesus Christ, will provide that peace. We'll stay in Isaiah 57 and come to verse 19 now. God says that I create the fruit of the lips. Peace. Peace to him that is far off, and to him that is near, says the Lord, and I will heal him. If we want more certainty in our lives, if we want the peace that comes with that certainty, there's only one way it's available, and that is through the promise of God. We'll stay in the prophet Isaiah. Can we come now to Isaiah chapter 26, please? Isaiah 26. This is a wonderful passage because this is the personal promise of Almighty God to us. Isaiah 26, verses 3 and 4. Isaiah reads, "You will keep him in perfect peace, whose mind is stayed on you, because he trusts in you, the God of Israel. Trust in the Lord forever, for in the Lord Yahweh is everlasting strength." That is the means whereby we can be stabilised in our lives, where the uncertainty in our lives, despite the surrounding uncertainty, the uncertainty in our lives is removed in our reliance on God. And as David Hill so beautifully explained this morning, with that peace comes the certainty of God's care for us now, and his bringing us into the kingdom age. We might refer to Luke 12, verse 32. "Fear not, little flock. It is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom." All right, that's our personal promise that God has given. How does that help Britain, the United States and Australia? Well, with the rule of Christ, there will be fair decisions all around. Let's have a look at Micah chapter 4, please. Micah chapter 4. Micah chapter 4, and we'll pick up at verse 3. Micah chapter 4, verse 3. Context, of course, is the nations in verse 2 coming up, worshipping the God of Jacob, teaching us of his ways, walking in his paths. So there's the context, the nations understanding the will of God. And the consequence, verse 3, he will judge among many people and rebuke strong nations afar off, and they shall beat their swords into ploughshares, and so forth. So, of course, the most obvious benefit is the abolition of war. But the other benefit is that with a supreme God vesting power in the Lord Jesus Christ, making wise decisions, and let's face it, no decision that's ever made will give everybody what they want. But if they're fair decisions, people will accept them. They can see the wisdom and justice of those decisions. So this is what the rule of Christ promises. Let's come back to our reading of Luke 21, please. Luke 21, and this time we'll pick up the reading at verse 28. Now remember our context again. Jesus talking about Jerusalem being trampled until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. He says, verse 28, "When these things begin to come to pass, then look up and lift up your heads, for your redemption draws nigh." And so we should look up and that's the personal encouragement to us. We'll put Luke verse 36 on hold for a while. There is the personal joy for us that the kingdom promises. Revelation 7. Let's have a look at Revelation. Keep your hand in Luke 21. We will come back to that. But let's go to Revelation chapter 7, please. Again, another promise of the future. Revelation 7, verse 14. Verse 13, one of the elders says, "Who are these arrayed in white robes? When do they come from?" Verse 14, "These are they which came out of great tribulation and have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. Therefore are they before the throne of God and serve him day and night in his temple. And he who sits on the throne shall dwell among them." Okay, that's really good. What are the benefits that flow from that? What does it matter when we're before God day and night? Verse 16, "They shall hunger no more, neither thirst any more, neither shall the sun light on them, nor any heat. For the Lamb which is in the midst of the throne shall feed them and shall lead them to living fountains of waters, and God shall wipe away all tears from their eyes." God shall wipe away all tears. That's the wonderful personal promise for us. And there are benefits for the nations all around with the righteous rule of Jesus Christ. But how shall we close our current affairs session today? There could be no better than verse 36. Luke 21, verse 36. "Watch therefore and pray always, that you may be accounted worthy to escape all these things." Right, these are problems and we need to escape them. It's not that they don't impact us, they do. And Jesus says we watch and pray to escape these things that shall come to pass and to stand before the Son of Man. And in the context of what he's saying here, it means to stand accepted before the Son of Man. May that indeed be our great privilege.